order and the interests of different groups in how it evolves. And so thinking about regional order rather than the actual islands themselves starts to open up a variety of debates and questions and perspectives. The most pessimistic one is that there are incompatible visions of regional order in East Asia, the Western Pacific, between what the vision China has, which is something akin to the Monroe Doctrine. I think the video that you had looked at has someone referring to this analogy. Whereas the U.S. has long regarded the Pacific Ocean as integral to its interests, this settlement of where we are standing, the land of the Kalapuya, but the Euro-American settlement was in a way a race to have access to trade in East Asia, and there was a trade with the furs and porcelain and silk from China and goods from the eastern U.S. which would be shipped around. So anyway, we are intimately connected to this trans-Pacific notion of America's interests. Manifest Destiny was not only about consolidating U.S. Euro-American U.S. rule over the continent, but of having access to the Pacific Rim, although that was not a phrase then. And so the problem is, if China wants the Western Pacific to be a Monroe Doctrine of China's own making, and the U.S. wants to continue its posture, which was adopted in the age of the Spanish-American War when the U.S. Occupied the Philippines, and then after the Second World War, the U.S. has a system of alliances and interests there. From the U.S. point of view, the goal is not to have an empire there, but although it can be referred to in imperial terms, I mean, Hawaii having been an independent kingdom, and then it could be called an informal empire, an empire of liberty, but the U.S. has alliances and military facilities and trade interests and so on. So the U.S. Definition of its interests is, we want the region to remain open. But as I'll show you later, China's concerned with the deployment of U.S. Assets and military facilities and its role in regulating how regional interactions occur, economic ones, diplomatic ones, military ones in that region. And so the most pessimistic take on this period of history is that we're in a dangerous time. There is a whole body of discussion and theory in political science, international relations, called power transition theory. And it refers to a period of history in which an incumbent leader, there's a term called hegemon in the field, the incumbent leader in a region or in the world is challenged by a rising power. And that the transition to a new distribution of power in the world or in a region is dangerous. Once you get to the hope is there's a new equilibrium, a new arrangement of power relationships. But the transition from the old one to the new one is dangerous, according to this theory. And the most talked about version of this discussion and this kind of thinking, this sort of, and it's a realpolitik way of thinking, because it doesn't care about democracy, non-democracy, it doesn't care about interdependence, any of these other things, globalization. It just pushes that aside and says you have an incumbent power and a rising power. And Graham Allison, a very famous political scientist at Harvard's Kennedy School, and he wrote a classic book on the Cuban Missile Crisis back in, a long time ago, decades ago. So he's come out with this book last year, and you look at the title and it's, wow, it's very pessimistic, Destined for War. I wish the question mark was after that, but the question mark comes in the subtitle, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Thucydides, the Athenian Greek general and the father of history sometimes referred to, with the classic account of the Peloponnesian War. And in his Peloponnesian War history, Thucydides made the claim that the ultimate cause of the war was the growing power of Athens and the fear this inspired in Sparta. And then they had other allied city-states, and they had a devastating war which weakened them. Eventually the Macedonians came under Philip, Alexander the Great's father, and conquered the Greek city-states. They had weakened themselves through war. And in his book, Graham Allison talks about, I forget how many, I should have the number, but I think it's 16, 17 power transitions in history, and says only 3 of them avoided war. One was when the Spanish kingdom overtook Portugal, which was the first European country to colonize the world with long-distance navigation in the 15th century. So that was peaceful. Portugal was too small, and just sort of, there was the agreement with the Pope to divide up the Western Hemisphere, and that agreement, the Treaty of Tordesillas, I think, avoided a conflict. And the other one was when the U.S. Was a rising power in the United Kingdom, and the British Empire was the incumbent power, and there was a peaceful transition there. The U.S. and Britain didn't seek to preempt the U.S. rise at the end of the 19th century, and the U.S. didn't seek to sort of push Britain out of wherever its empire was at the time. The U.S. focused on Spain's empire and fought a war against Spain in 1898 and 99. But Britain, the incumbent hegemon, yielded gracefully, according to the argument, to the U.S. And the last one is Germany's rise in the last 30 years in Europe. Yes? No questions? Oh, okay. So what are the keys to these peaceful examples, and can they apply to the Western Pacific, the Eastern Asia? And if you take, for example, Germany and Europe now, Germany sort of calls the shots. France was sort of in charge with Britain on the side in the European Union. Now Germany's powerful. But Germany's democratic. Despite all the history, Germany's democratic. There's a lot of integration and interdependence, and there are a lot of rules and institutions in Europe. There's the European Union. It's looking a little sickly at the moment, the European Union, but it's certainly better than what prevailed prior to the formation of the European Union in terms of maintaining. So in that environment, you can have this power transition, this redistribution of power, the rise of a new power without an open conflict. But when we look at East Asia, the other thing about Europe is it's mostly democratic. It mostly shares a kind of Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment culture and the Renaissance and the rest of it, whereas East Asia lacks that kind of common cultural framework. There's just incredible divergence and diversity in the forms of the states. Some are single-party states, some are democracies, some are other regimes, monarchies, et cetera, et cetera. Their cultures differ greatly, not to mention the United States and China and Japan, and their strategic cultures, that is their beliefs about international politics. One of the things about international politics that many scholars say is that the world becomes the way people imagine it will become. If you plan for the worst, you'll get the worst. If you're more optimistic and open, you'll get that outcome. The problem with that is if countries have different visions of the future, then that could be self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, Asia is integrating, but that interdependence is far deeper. The countries trade with each other. There's a lot of movement back and forth, but that interdependence has outstripped the institutional rules that regulate disputes. Whereas in Europe, the EU was built in order to get economic integration. In Asia, you've had sort of integration informally, and the institutions lag, according to this argument. And finally, nationalism is very alive and present in Asia in a way that we thought it might be fading in Europe. We're not so sure now, or in the United States. A certain kind of nationalism that views, sort of a xenophobic nationalism. It may be making a comeback around the world, but certainly in Asia it never went away. And there are competing versions of history, who did what to whom in the Pacific War, the World War II, and earlier. So all of that makes us quite pessimistic, or people quite pessimistic. And in that context, the South China Sea dispute becomes very explicable. It's not about the reefs, it's about this larger picture. But the optimistic vision is one of an Asian renaissance. I mentioned this growing trade interdependence. It's not just trade, it's tourism. I remember when I was young and tourists from Japan, and I think the linkage here is much richer, the long history of our, the building we're meeting in. It's educational, it's an exchange of culture and values. But just taking tourism, I remember traveling in Asia in the early 90s, late 80s, it was, there was the old, in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, right, it was the, pardon the phrase, the ugly American, right, going around, and some people in Europe were a little, those Americans are boorish and they don't understand. And then there was a phase when the Japanese middle class was going out, and so on and so on. And Chinese tourism is huge, and educational exchanges and economic exchanges. So that we call regionalization. All of that interdependence, there are growing ties of travel, television shows, Korean soap operas becoming popular in China and vice versa, and so on and so on. We call that regionalization. Regionalism, on the other hand, is the building of actual regional organizations, like, I guess, analogous to the European Union or NAFTA in this part of the world. So when I said before that the interdependence outstrips the institutions, we could say yes, but maybe that's good because some of the disputes can be shelved and just have people integrate and exchange. And then the building of institutions and rules is coming along. And given that everyone is so economically interdependent, maybe even if they really have these irritants like the South China Sea, they will be restrained in sort of pursuing conflict, because you can be angry at those people over there, but when your bread and butter depends on maintaining an exchange relationship with them, you might think twice about escalating. So it's not that trade and integration solves the problem of the South China Sea, but it may keep it separate, keep it under wraps. And that could be hopeful. It's called the commercial peace or the liberal peace. And then, again, regional institutions are being created to manage this. Now, another vision of how this transition could occur peacefully is simply that the rest of the U.S. kind of grumbles, but actually pulls back. And China rises, and countries in the region simply say, okay. It's called bandwagoning. And throughout most of recorded human history, China was the center of this whole part of the world. And there is an argument that says this is, and it did so according to China's own version without invading and dominating. They contrast their history to the Western European history and American history of going out and trying to convert people literally or politically, or they said we had trade relations. It was called the tributary system, and it was peaceful and so on. There's a dispute about that because, well, I won't go into the details whether China's expansion was peaceful, but relative to European or even American conquest of the Philippines and Hawaii and, et cetera, you could argue it. So maybe the region will shift into a new arrangement peacefully that way. It'll just, and given the instability of U.S. foreign policy recently, maybe you could make a good argument for that. Another peaceful scenario is that the U.S. and China just agree to disagree on some things and sort of negotiate between themselves. Other countries in Asia have been quite worried about this from time to time, if they think that the two powerful states have an interest in not fighting each other and in cutting a deal that doesn't acknowledge the interests of, say, other countries, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and so on. But there's a final peaceful vision, which is based on an organization called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These are smaller countries, although Indonesia is huge population-wise. It's the fourth largest country after China, India, the United States. And they have this regional organization that originally in the 60s was formed, late 60s, to keep the peace in Southeast Asia, and then has conducted outreach. Let me see if I can, no? Uh-oh. Oh, there it is. Oh, that's the one I need to do. I have a map up. That's not the, here, no, that's not what I want. A map of Southeast Asia. I was going to show you a map of Southeast Asia. I can just put it up quickly. The other tab. Lawrence Arabian, Southeast Asia. Let's try this again. Here it is. Okay. There we go. So here is Southeast Asia. These countries, they made an organization to keep the peace among themselves. It's been quite successful for decades, 50 years, without open war, despite a lot of tensions. And they're inviting the rest of the region into these organizations, which I'll mention. So maybe this rise of China and the power transition will be peaceful because of, and it's not just a set of organizations, it's called the ASEAN way, or the Asian way of diplomacy, which means if things are difficult, don't try to nail them all down. The South China Sea being a case in point. Don't try to solve the sovereignty question, who owns those things. Come on, just sidestep it, keep talking, and start to do joint economic development with just leaving aside the thing you know you're not going to solve. And so this diplomatic culture may be the key to the future in that region. A little history. Actually, the pessimism that a lot of people feel now is surprising to me. I mean, it's, if you've been following, because there was a decade of really, or more, of really optimism. It started with a crisis. That is, in 1996, the US sent two aircraft carrier battle groups to the edges of the Taiwan Strait, which is between Taiwan and China. And many of you may know that Taiwan is a de facto independent. Here's Taiwan right here. So the US put its carriers here and at the northern end. Taiwan was having an election and a pro-independence candidate was about to win. The People's Republic of China, mainland China, shot missiles into the ocean to scare the Taiwanese, and then the US sent the carriers. It looked bad. It was another moment of fright, China being much less powerful now than it is now. But the upshot was China rethought. They scared everybody in the region and they realized it. And the US was like, gee, we don't want this either. And that ushered in a decade or more of peaceful development of regional institutions, peaceful development of deepening the interdependence. And China proclaimed its doctrine of peaceful rise, or peaceful development, they call it sometimes. And the US responded in kind, saying, well, we welcome your rise. We're not trying to keep you down. So we just want you to be a responsible stakeholder. And Southeast Asia, that's when they began reaching out from their internal ASEAN, this organization they'd formed, to having ASEAN Plus. ASEAN Plus 3, China, South Korea, Japan. ASEAN Plus this, the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, the Defense Ministers meeting plus the other defense. So the ASEAN began expanding. And their goal was to enmesh China in interdependent ties and organizations, because they felt that whether China would be aggressive or not depended on this balance of cooperation and rivalry. They even, relative to the South China Sea dispute you read about, they even came up with a declaration on conduct of the parties. It didn't settle anything, but it said, here's how we should behave. It was non-binding, but it was a declaration. And they said, in future, we will develop a binding code of conduct. So things are good for this period of time. And I supervised senior theses at Willamette, in which people were trying to explain why things were so peaceful and heading in a peaceful direction, and the power transition in Asia was going so smoothly. Oh, sorry, wrong page down. But things changed around 2009, 2010. On the one hand, you had a continuation of the economic integration. So the regional order is kind of diverting into two different dynamics, two different patterns. In the economic sphere, intra-regional internal trade is growing, investment is growing. And there was a question, in fact, a lot of the trade in Asia is connected to the United States or Europe. That is, they trade among parts and components among themselves, often US companies or Japanese or European or Chinese companies are trading and producing in different locations, subcontracting, and then they put the whole thing together. Your iPhone, for example, is made by a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, that is totally based in the mainland China, and then it's designed by Apple, and then it comes. So the point is, even though they're trading a lot with each other, a lot of the final demand goes to the United States. But in this period, there's a lot of debate among economists, and it's kind of tricky to measure it, how much of the demand is now arising, the final demand is arising within the region. Because if they are trading with each other and not dependent on outside markets, then that's significant. Then that becomes more of a force for unity, one would argue, in Asia. At the same time, the strategic picture turns darker around this time. There's an arms buildup. There are the territorial disputes that are mentioned in your reading. Nationalism is on the rise as countries. It turns out that often the vision of middle-class people as the sort of cosmopolitan is wrong. Often, middle-class people are the most concerned about national prestige, for example, much more so than often than people who are less educated. For example, in China, some of the most nationalistic people are not the ones that have never traveled outside of the country, but the ones precisely who have, and even studied in Europe or the United States. And the various institutions that were springing up that I talked about, sort of like the European Union, so many of them sprang up that it started to look fragmented. Unlike the European Union, which has Brussels, and then everything is organized. So the hopeful signs started to. This, by the way, I was talking about the trade. Again, I study economics or economies. I'm not an economist as such. This is the share of internal trade in Asia and Europe and North America, NAFTA. If you see, it goes from 1990 about 45% in Asia, the red line, and it's getting closer to the European level, which is remarkable because Europe is an integrated economy. I mean, there are no barriers. So that's pretty amazing to think about. So the region is coming together economically, although the question remains how much of that ultimately goes into products that go outside the region. I talked about the disputes, and your reading talks a little bit about this dispute, which I'm not going to focus on because most of the focus is on the South China Sea. But I don't have a laser pointer, but this is the Japanese term, Senkaku. Diaoyu is the Chinese term, the Diaoyutai Islands. And you can see the overlapping claims there. The red line is the exclusive economic, oh, there it is. Thank you. The exclusive economic border claimed by Japan runs like this. The exclusive economic border claimed by China is here, and the islands are right in the middle. And there's gas and oil and so on very close by. These are the islands themselves, the Senkaku, Diaoyutai. The official state guest house for heads of state that visit Beijing is called one of them is called the Diaoyu guest house. They've had clashes of Coast Guard vessels and so on and demonstrations periodically, so it's a very tense situation. Also, China about 4 years ago, 4 years ago, declared an air defense information zone requesting that everyone get permission to fly through what most countries think are international airspace. And most countries ignore it, but they've declared it. Here we come to the South China Sea. I have about 15 more minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, and then we'll do some questions, then we'll come back after. Complicated map. These red lines are what China claims. Here's China. This is Hainan. You can see the other countries. Look at that. They call it the cow's tongue because it looks like a cow's tongue sticking way down. These are the Spratlys. These are the Paracels, which are only disputed by China and, of course, Taiwan, which formally, it's complicated, claims to be China, but there's only one China, everyone agrees, but they can't agree which is the real China. Please stand up. So, and Vietnam claims this, and China ejected Vietnam, it was then South Vietnam, ejected them in 1975 during the end of that conflict. Scarborough Shoal has been the site of a standoff that's just between the Philippines and China. But this is the Spratlys. Brunei has this claim, but look at it overlaps with, well, no, it doesn't overlap with Malaysia's claim. Malaysia recognizes that. But you also have Vietnam's claim, which overlaps. So these are all disputed between different countries. China's claim is here, and so on. So you can see these different countries with their overlapping claims. And this has been this way for decades, but it's recently gotten more serious. That's just another graphic that shows who is occupying what. Vietnam is all the black squares. China are the red triangles. Malaysia's got these here. Now I notice Malaysia is, I know something about this, but I couldn't tell you the details, but this is Brunei's claim, but Malaysia has a facility there, Philippines, and so on. And Taiwan, which is China, according to their own and official position. Okay, why is this situation getting more tense? I want to focus on the US role and the Chinese role. The US in 2010 proclaimed, this is President Obama, and Hillary Clinton was the architect of this, well, yes. And they said, we need to rebalance America's global posture. We need to pivot to Asia. We've been bogged down in wars in the Middle East. They reacted to China's peaceful rise diplomacy, its charm offensive in the region. There was this discourse, which personally I'm going to argue against in the second half, which viewed China's growing influence as a threat or as a problem. The feeling was the US had not paid attention and China had gotten some advantage. My personal response to preview it is, if China's getting advantage because they're doing things in a peaceful way, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But they said, wait, we better catch up. So they announced the pivot. And in security terms, they strengthen and upgrade their existing alliances with South Korea and Japan, and they renewed arrangements with the Philippines, and then some smaller arrangements, not formal bases and so on, with Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia, and so on. And cultivate India and Vietnam, which have been at arm's length from the US during the Cold War, but encouraging them to get involved. And encouraging Japan, crucially, to start doing more in the region. Japan has a pacifist constitution imposed on it largely by the United States, but now the US and Japan, some people in Japan want it to change. Economic, let's make our own free trade deal with some of our allies there, but not others, certainly not China. Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you may know about, and which is now dead, or maybe not quite dead. I mean, dead for the US. President Trump declared we'd get out. Crucially, the US had never taken a position on the dispute that I showed you the map before. Said it's not our matter. We take no position. But now they say, well, but we have a specific interest in this dispute because of freedom of navigation and trade. As part of this, made new military commitments. They sent a battalion of rotating deployment of Marines to Darwin, Australia. I won't bother showing you, it's on the north part of Australia. They signed a new agreement and deployed troops to fight against the war on terror in the Philippines, and so there's more military. The US cultivates Myanmar or Burma as a kind of pulling away from China with also a political change in that country. But then on the cooperative side, the US Obama administration signs a deal with China, which paves the way for the Paris Climate Accord. So that's one element, was to engage China as well on climate issues in particular. But things keep getting worse in the South China Sea, and the US issues a warning, and then begins doing a thing called FONOPS, which are mentioned in your reading. Remember FONOPS? Sounds like telephone operations, but is really not. This is a FONOP done near Subi Reef, which is a Chinese facility. This is the USS Lawson. They just go through with no prior notice because these are international waters. And here is a list of the FONOPS. But the People's Liberation Army Navy, I always thought it was funny, the Army Navy, sounds like the football game, but it's the PLA Navy, is shadowing all the time, and has, occasionally there have been near collisions and some other issues. I'll do China's, and then we'll be close to stopping, or just wave at me when it's, because I can stop, and then we'll take questions, and then I'll come to the concluding part after the first session of Q&A. So, as I will argue later, I think the U.S. overdid with this. Yes, China was getting more influence in the region, but it's going to get more influence. And if they got more influence because you were distracted, you, the U.S., we, and they're doing what they should be doing and respecting multilateral behavior, not in terms of in the South China Sea explicitly, but then I think the response might have been different. However, China is hardly sort of blameless or innocent in this. There was a perception in China that with the big recession of 2007, 2008, that the U.S. decline was accelerating, and now's the time to really start throwing weight around. And from 2009 onward, they start deploying Coast Guard vessels more to this region, the South China Sea, and fishing fleet incidents, but somehow where the fishing boat has a big machine gun on it and other things of this sort. Then there's a standoff in that Scarborough Shoal, which was that little near the Philippines. Let's see. Here. So the only dispute there is between the Philippines and China, and there's a standoff. Then in 2014, they move a drilling rig into an area claimed by Vietnam, not in the South China Sea well, it's in the South China Sea. It's not in the Spratlys, it's more in this area, somewhere around here. And there are demonstrations in Vietnam. They actually killed several people died. Some demonstrators actually set fire to a factory, which they thought was Chinese, but was Taiwanese, which is China, but it's sort of strange. You know, when things get this bad, often people who have nothing to do with things get caught in the middle. For a long time, by the way, Indonesia, which is really a regional heavyweight, it punches under its weight, but it's a big country. If you notice, Indonesia, which is down here, this is Natuna, this area, this island called Natuna, but they're not disputing anything, and they try to position themselves as brokers, honest brokers. The problem is China really overplayed its hand, I think, just as I was arguing the U.S. in a way was unconstructive in overselling it. And they started talking about their economic rights beyond even this line. Well, this line doesn't quite tell you, right? They leave it vague. And suddenly the Indonesians who were trying to tell everyone to calm down became alarmed, and they start having clashes with fishermen and so on. And they seize some Chinese fishing vessels. But then the real problem comes. China says, okay, the U.S. has said the U.S. is concerned with this. This is our territorial water. This is integral to our nation, and we're going to prove it. And they started dredging and building these reefs into islands. The Philippines sued them over this other Scarborough Shoal issue and other things, and the International Court of Arbitration ruled against China last year. But so here's an example. This is the original reef, and there's like a little rock sticking out, and then they start dredging, and then they have a facility. Here again, it's hard to see because that looks like an island, but actually it's just that fringe that has sand. The rest of it's a little bit underwater, and then by the end you see where the sand is. And they've done this to 8 or 9 islands. All right, I think I'll stop there and take questions. And then, is it time? Are we right on time? I have more to say to conclude all this, but we have the second half, right? Okay, questions? Should I take them? Yeah. Oh, they'll tell me, okay. Yes.
Go. I couldn't help but notice you didn't mention North Korea. How does that play into all of this?
What's that?
I couldn't help but
North Korea.
you didn't mention North Korea at all.
Right. Well,
How does
I
that
lectured
play?
last year on North Korea to the ICL. Sorry. Yes, no, right. So regional order, I think, is very, okay. Right, they're worried now, right? The planes and so on. So at least I'm not flying a plane. But absolutely, what happens there matters a lot, and I think could overshadow this dispute in terms of the implications for the broader regional order. That one worries me more than this. A lot more, actually. So, yes, is a short answer.
Hi, this is Cassia. You started to talk a little bit about about the Vietnamese situation, North, South Malaysia, Indonesia, that sort of thing. Are they continuing to rise as a power in the region, or are they just sort of sitting back and waiting to see what happens? And if so, what are their economic chances of becoming a stronger power in the area? And you've also got, I think, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, who
Right.
might be part of this whole Asian community.
ASEAN is the grouping.
Yes, and so what is likely to happen with them? Because there's a lot of land and a lot of people out there
Yes.
just seem to be sitting around doing not much of anything at the moment.
Oh, well, I did allude, and I want to come back to it and elaborate, because that's, I think, really on the theme that I want to talk about. As I mentioned, but didn't go into it, and there's more, I have some graphics that will make this clearer. At the end of the Cold War, Southeast Asia was divided during the Cold War, and the capitalist part of Southeast Asia formed this group called ASEAN, this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to keep the peace among themselves so that they could be stronger to resist the spread of communism, the domino theory, and so on. When the Cold War ended, they decided to reach out to communist Southeast Asia and bring them in to the tent, because everyone was reforming, communism is not an international threat, and they succeeded. And these countries that you mentioned joined. So they're all unified. But then they're worried that they will be subject to a kind of new Cold War between China and the US and Japan. So they said, if we stick together, we can be stronger, as you were implying. And so they weren't inactive, actually. They were very active in the way I just briefly mentioned, which is they took their ASEAN organization and began adding the plus. And so they were reaching out to the region and to the world, but because the US is a Pacific power in this context, an Asian power. So they built new forums, which I will show you a graphic on, to try to enmesh China and even enmesh the United States, to keep the United States involved. The risk in trying to reach out as a group of medium powers or smaller countries, when you try to enmesh the big giants, if you bring them in, that's good, but then they might also pull you apart. And that's sort of what's happened. These countries, not Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia, are so dependent now on China economically and other ways, that when they want to make any sort of common cause, China is able to stop even ASEAN from doing that now. So they tried to create regional institutions in which ASEAN, this grouping, stronger together, as you were, I think, suggesting, would be the fulcrum, would be the agenda setter, would be the host of all the wider regional dialogues. And that's kind of stalled, because they also dispute with each other. So it's hard to keep that unity. But they've tried. And my conclusion, which I'll get to after the break, is I think the United States certainly, I think China would be wise to do this, should, even though they're more powerful, should in a way defer and encourage that kind of process. The way to solve the wider regional rivalry, although the Korean conflict is beyond this, could be that the stronger powers agree to let this collection of medium and less powerful countries set the agenda, be in the driver's seat, and to channel their sort of rivalry in peaceful ways through those organizations. Unfortunately, it's been going the other way recently on this, but not entirely. There's, as I'll mention later. But thanks for that. I think I'm biased, I study Southeast Asia. I think Southeast Asia is key. And they've tried, but it's hard when you're not as powerful.
This is Ken. If I remember right, when I took your class ages ago, one of the questions you asked right at the beginning of the year is whether the U.S. would be as dominant in 25 years as it was then.
Well, we're halfway along.
And I was impressed that almost every student in the class said no. I guess, what do you see as the role of the U.S. if we let China assume the kind of power they're probably going to assume, peacefully or not?
Yeah, so all these questions are leading where I want to go, but I think it's good to go there now, which is, I think there's hopefully a middle way between sort of just letting the current China, the kind of China that we see now, between saying, okay, we give up and we're pulling out, and you go ahead and do this, between that option and what the U.S. has tried to do, I'm previewing what I'll come back to. There's a middle way, which I just described, which has to do with Southeast Asia and with trying to build inclusive regional institutions. I might call it back to enmeshment. I think the U.S. I'm very critical, and you'll hear from another speaker, I think, later this term, who's more an insider and more knows and would probably disagree, but I think the U.S. has overplayed and then fallen back. Okay, they got all these Southeast Asian countries on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, some of you may know. It's an economic agreement that the U.S. was trying to pick and choose who was going to be members of the club. And they squeezed them and said, you want us to protect you against China, you got to join us, and you got to give us all these things. And they painfully signed on the dotted line, and the U.S. left them at the altar. Now, I'm not a fan, actually, of the TPP per se. And I said, I think, to this audience, it's going to be bad if the U.S. pulls out, and it's going to be bad if it doesn't pull out and it stays. I didn't like it. And this is the dynamic that I just think is not wise for the United States. This pivot, the whole concept is a problem, right, to me. I mean, and then now you're pivoting out again. That is not a recipe for a stable equilibrium in the region. Because what China's doing is is scaring people. It's not and China's claim has been thoroughly rejected by the Court of Arbitration in The Hague. I mean, it's just that cow's tongue. I mean, why wouldn't people living in that region be, you're claiming everything because some fishermen and there was some chips of porcelain found from the 12th century. You can't just take that. But of course they look at the Falklands and they look at the U.S., why are you in Hawaii? And that's the way they think about it, so.
I have a question. I have some concerns about technology and how, I'm not sure how this is related, but having different parts of internationally, different parts being developed in different countries, is there, how much of a risk is, I assume that one of the real strengths of this country is its innovation and its the technological, the kind of universities we have, and that are lacking in other countries, and the advancements we've made has given us an edge that seems to me very advantageous to our self-interest.
Yes.
So, but at the same time, we're using economic means by which to mesh with them, and there are advantages to corporations, obviously, to ship off different parts of. Like I'm surprised that I have a friend that works for Boeing, and it's like it is amazing how
the co-production
technology is dispersed amongst so many different countries. Could you just make a comment about that?
Well, this is political economy the first thing I'll say is what you just talked about, I think, is far more important than who owns little submerged reefs. And even if you want to take a dark view, and I think Graham Allison's view is too dark, this kind of power transition, Thucydides trap. The one thing he did say in that book, though, was the way you, quote, have a good transition and whatever is you focus on making sure you are internally strong. It's still this us versus them idea, realpolitik, but it focuses on something I think that's more important, even if you take that view. But I think, yeah, if you're going to be concerned about China and you want to view them as a rival, why aren't you worried about the cyber, security than this? I'm not a military expert, and I've heard different things, and I guess another speaker that may be coming may know a lot more about this. There is a very significant logistical issue here, right? A third of the world's trade comes through this, and so on. But in a case of an actual war, heaven forbid, I'm not sure that that's a huge advantage there. It does allow them now to patrol a lot more, that they have those facilities, but that's it. I would worry much more about those things, or I would view positively much more about making sure the U.S. itself is, vibrant, strong, and engaged in what I would call a human development perspective. If China, this is what I was saying when the U.S. did the pivot, if China got more influence because they were being good neighbors, why not respond by being a better neighbor and helping educational exchanges and other things in this region and offer a better deal, so to speak? But instead, both China and the U.S. are kind of playing a game of polarization, which I don't think serves the U.S., much less the people of the region.
Can you take one more question before the break?
Sure.
Okay, this is Sally Shriver. You haven't mentioned Taiwan and the pact that we have, or the treaty we have with them, and does that interfere with all of this good stuff?
Does it interfere? Well, that's a complex question. I'm not a security studies person. I think the Korea crisis and the implications it might have if, for example, Japan rearms in ways that it hasn't, and even the issue of nuclear rearmament, which most Japanese people oppose, but the government may not oppose, and other things. The Taiwan crisis, I know Randy is a world expert on this and knows, has forgotten in the last week more than I'll ever know about that subject. I haven't read a lot recently that it's on a tenterhooks kind of situation there, the Taiwanese economy is completely integrated with the mainland economy as well. I think the question there is whether that can be still put off on the side burner for another half century, because I don't see it resolving, and hopefully it's not escalating. The Korean Peninsula issue is an escalation. This thing is getting worse. I don't know enough to answer authoritatively or confidently about the Taiwan Straits situation. And the good stuff between the Taiwan and the mainland, right? They're completely interdependent and integrated now, and a lot of good things were happening, but there was a kind of pushback by Taiwanese people against a government that was the KMT government, that was doing these China deals. So there seems to be, I think the long-term trend there is integration, but China's treatment of Hong Kong certainly does not inspire anyone in Taiwan to say, oh, okay, so this economic and social integration and then the tourism and the rest that I talked about is leading to a kind of resolution. I don't have that optimism. I'm just hoping it's off on the side, but I'm not sure and I haven't studied it. So.
We're very grateful for your insights, and we look forward to the next time. Have a break, 10 minutes.
To one thing that I noticed in there, that for years, the U.S. has been in control of those seas, or thought they had been in control of those seas. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, if we think we control China's seas. So I hope you comment on that. I mean, you have commented on a little bit, but.
Thanks. So just picking up on that question, you're asking the U.S. has controlled those seas, and that might be perceived as a threat to China. It doesn't make sense. Right. So the rationale for the U.S. being the dominant power, well, I think this is the issue that, and I think to give us a choice of the video or more Q&A, the U.S. has been the dominant power regulating this region and since the end of the Pacific War, and of course had colonized the Philippines at the end of the 19th century. So, but the U.S. argument is, or would be, everybody has benefited, including China, from that order. And that the U.S. is the security provider. It's offshore, it's not trying to colonize anyone. I mean, Philippines got independence, and so why would China, why wouldn't China just be a responsible stakeholder? and join the existing order? Why does it have to challenge the order? Why does it have to do a cow's tongue? That's is a funny image, but is frightening if you can see why it would be frightening. And why can't China and then China's trying to push the U.S. back. There's this island chain theory. So there's the inner island chain, the second island chain, and then there's Hawaii. And that the U.S. alliance structure in the region has provided stability and benefited everyone. And China needs to, that in fact, the critique is if China's benefiting, what's their concern? Now China could say they're encircled, and I have a slide that could show that by U.S. alliances. So there's this kind of dispute, and this, by the way, is a classic. It could be understood in terms of the classic security dilemma. What makes the U.S. secure, which is to maintain its existing alliances and existing deployments, which it claims benefits everyone, which is a strong argument, is a threat. Quote, China perceives it as threatening, and then China's trying to just secure itself, but then it threatens everyone, and that's how that Thucydides trap supposedly operates. And I think that's not wrong. I think that's wrong, mostly wrong, because as Peter O'Toole said, I have the clip up, but time is tight. It's not the inexorable structural logic of this argument is, I think, overdrawn. It's not inevitable. Regional order is not set in stone because of the transition in power, the rise of China. The U.S., and the flip side of that is the U.S. is not in some sort of inexorable decline. I think most of the sort of weakening of U.S. interests in Asia and elsewhere is self-inflicted rather than some kind of decline. I think the U.S. has a lot of economic issues that it needs to attend to, but I don't think that kind of power transition theory is far too deterministic, far too sort of, it portrays changes like this as far too determined and inexorable. And I am not a security expert, and I hope hear from someone who is much more knowledgeable about this, but what I read and what I can understand is that the reefs are not completely significant militarily. They do provide, now that they've been turned into islands and there are facilities on them, they do have some military significance, to be sure, and they allow China to run these fishing fleets and these Coast Guard operations in a much more sustained and pervasive way. But China was already doing that just at greater cost and logistical distance. Rather, I think, again, the dispute is at the fulcrum of questions, or a fulcrum, because the earlier question reminded us about the Korean Peninsula crisis. And when we had a question on Taiwan, all of these are crucial. And how they get managed are crucial indicators of regional order and the security architecture, which is a term that means the distribution of alliances and organizations and norms. My critique and answer is that no one wins from polarization. China's and the U.S. now, and this comes, I think, from a understanding that is shaped by the years I've spent in Southeast Asia, looking upward towards this dispute. The U.S. and China and Japan each is overestimating its own ability as well as its rivals to shape the regional order to its narrow advantage. Each is underemphasizing the need for domestic changes that could enhance regional cooperation and stability, and underestimating the advantages of inclusive or region-wide multilateralism, meaning organizations that everyone's a part of, even if they're irritated with each other, even if not all the disputes are being solved, at least they can be managed or put to the side. This is, again, the ASEAN way, sometimes called the Asian way of diplomacy. I think the pivot was largely counterproductive because it is, for a couple of reasons. One is, the U.S. itself is unsure about what it wants. It usually says to maintain security preeminence or dominance in order to make sure the region is open and accessible, and those are classic goals, and the security it provides is a benefit to the region, fine. But does the U.S. want to maintain that role at it, even without the economic benefits that many people want from that? And so the TPP reversal is a classic example of, like, U.S. There's a debate in the U.S. that needs to be, in some sense, reconciled with its role. And so the problem here is that I think maintaining the U.S. posture, as you were asking earlier as we started this section, may not be politically and economically sustainable for, I think, less so the economics. I think it may not be what the U.S. wants. Regional orders have to change, not least because China is rising, but also because U.S. interests change and integration proceeds. And so the U.S. alliance system, it's not going to go away, but encouraging Japan to sort of rise up more militarily in the region under the present circumstances, I think is probably not the right way to go. It can't go that way in the end. And the U.S. overpromises and underdelivers in terms of its policy. Now, China is even, I think, worse than that, so I'm not blaming the U.S. for China's behavior. One thing I just noticed with these freedom of navigation operations that is very bizarre to me, I mean, I think your future speaker probably knows what's going on, but I didn't know, this surprised me, is that recently, a couple months ago, the U.S. did FONOPS, one of these sail-throughs, up here. Well, that's between Vietnam and China, and that's a whole different ballgame. It's one thing to say the cow's tongue shouldn't be here. I mean, remember, the U.S. said it didn't have a position on this for years until 2010, and then so on, and now it's getting more and more declarative. But why the U.S. wants to get involved here is very unclear to me with regard to Vietnam. But Vietnam was the one that stuck its neck out the most in negotiations on the TPP economic agreement, and then was left at the altar, and then, I don't know. So we'll see. This is that island chain thing. It's very blurry. I'm sorry. So the geostrategic argument is that China's trying to push the U.S. out of this zone, and then this is the second island chain, in that 50 years from now, supposedly China wants the U.S. to be behind that line, and I don't think that would be good for the region at all, of course. But from China's perspective, this is a Chinese source. You have U.S. deployments, so there's this nationalist discourse in China about being encircled. But again, from my perspective, from somebody who studies Southeast Asia and talks to a lot of people there most of the time, none of them want to have to choose. Even Australia has a debate actively about how much. No one is going to say we're shifting to China's side. China's been sort of throwing its weight around and scaring people. At the same time, economic interdependence and development is as crucial to those states and their stability as their external security, and they are enmeshed with China, and they don't want to choose. And so the question is not whether they're going to pick sides entirely, but whether on both sides, China and the United States, their bid to kind of up the ante and get people even to declare themselves more and more on their side. I want to suggest that between China and the United States, and to some extent Japan, the one that pushes hardest is the one that becomes the problem for those other countries. And the smart play and the better play is to think about not doing that and to create an alternate pathway that builds on this idea of enmeshment and creates or focuses on inclusive regional institutions. In fact, despite all of this kind of aggressive behavior and dredging and all the new facilities on these reefs that are now islands, they're sort of artificial islands, the Southeast Asian countries have renewed negotiations. They're hoping for a code of conduct. And they're not naive about China and its kind of throwing its weight around. But at the same time, China is offering a lot of investment and aid. This is One Belt, One Road to integrate the region, and is stepping up. Even as the United States seems to be ambivalent about whether it wants to I'm all about criticisms of globalization. My views are mixed, but China is trying to step into a kind of leadership role with investment and aid. And those countries are not going to simply say no just because of the South China Sea. These are the rail networks that are proposed. So, need for a new multilateralism. I don't think it can go the way of keeping the U.S. system. It's not abandoning it, but strengthening its hub and spoke alliances. The U.S. is the hub. It's alliance with South Korea. And there is an informal agreement with Taiwan, not a formal treaty, because the U.S. doesn't recognize. But there are commitments signed, and the Taiwan Cross Relations Act. So no one's talking about abandoning those, but thinking about the future. I don't think those are the future. They have to be maintained because China's land grab, right, can't simply be acquiesced to. So the FONOPS have to continue and so on. But what's the future? Where is it heading? And I just can't see exactly. On China's side, I think they're also just they're having trouble thinking strategically in the way that they did in the 90s and aughts, where they were very successful in sort of rising without scaring people. And the U.S. also, both powers seem to have lost certain capacity to think constructively about alternative regional orders and to move their policies in that direction. This is a bank. China has a lot of money. They waited and they wanted more say over the Asian Development Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The U.S. administrations, both W. Bush and, certainly Obama, were in favor of that. The Congress wouldn't act and wouldn't veto it, so China said, fine, we'll do our own bank to finance some of those rail investments and all those port investments I showed you. And the U.S. told everybody, don't join. And they said, we're joining, except Japan. They all joined. And it was overestimating your ability to keep the same status quo and deny China a leadership role, and underestimating the degree to which those countries are trying to adapt to a changing region. North Korea, we have to desperately try to re-engage that, which gets back to the earlier question. I'm very worried about Japan and the U.S. effort to encourage Japan to revise its constitution to allow it to be a military power in the region. But, of course, if North Korea threatens, it's hard not to do that. There are mechanisms of inter-Asian military cooperation, including maritime security coordination, and actually, if you talk to the military officers, they are much more, in touch with each other than than many people would understand. They are working out all sorts of protocols, which is desperately needed to avoid accidents on the seas and in the air. This is regional architecture. I won't go too much, but these are remember I said the regional architecture became fragmented. And I also talked about the ASEAN Plus. So this is that situation. Here's APEC, which is sort of not moribund. And here's China's organization that tries to stabilize, works with Russia to interact with the Central Asians. But I would do the big one. This is the ASEAN Regional Forum, but or the East Asia Summit. That's where we should, policy should aim. Here we have the economic. This is the TPP, but the TPP is gone. I think the U.S. should throw its weight around a bigger project in order to bring. The key thing here is the TPP excluded China. Which there are reasons to do because it's a huge state-run sector, and it's very hard to bring them in. But it was explicitly done to carve out allies and put them under the U.S. economic preferential trading agreement. I just wish it hadn't gone that way. But here is ASEAN again in charge, and they're hosting the related summits are the ones where they reach out to the rest of the region. Obama did it, here he is there, of course. He did sort of throw his weight behind it to a degree, but I think that's the way to go even more. So the region remains uneasily balanced between rivalry and integration, and it awaits creative and bold leadership to secure its stability. But to me, that's a general statement. China has to be afforded some leadership role. It can't stay the same. What's the phrase? If we're going to keep things the same, everything has to change, or if we don't want things to change, right, something like that. If we want things to stay the same, everything has to change. And that includes acknowledging legitimate Chinese leadership aspirations, but not land grabbing and dredging and taking cow's tongue positions off the shoreline of people 1,000 miles from China's integral territory. Within multilateral, and that's the second part, within multilateral institutions that respect regional states' interests as well as global security norms. So I hope, China, cooler heads prevail and strategic thinking flourishes. And I'll stop there. We can do questions or video.
Sharon here.
Go ahead.
I love your last slide, if only if it were true. I get your military situation here, but after traveling over there many times, well, several for me, that Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, the rest, they are starting to eat China's lunch in terms of what they can export. It's just amazing. A trip to their ports are absolutely incredible. And personally, I don't know, I don't get the statistics like you do, but I was seeing China starting to fight for their life in terms of economics. And it's true, they're affected more by climate change than anybody is on the whole planet. And in here, you visit these other countries in Southeast Asia, and they're doing coal plants, et cetera, et cetera. So I just see this region being, and I love your overlapping circles because there are interests within interests. And then my final concern is, one of them was the question about how to balance these Southeast Asia countries that have their own self-interest in an umbrella. And the second one is if this juggernaut does come, and it probably will.
Southeast Asian juggernaut.
Yes, Asia, period, and Russia being part of that too. How do you protect Europe from being sucked into that sphere? I don't see how you can. And then the third thing is, what do you see this Trump coming over there now in the next few days? What would you like to see happen?
Yeah. Well, the last one is just you just hope. You're in a fetal position, hoping some very odd and just damaging comment doesn't happen. I mean, the U.S. He has said things again like beating up on Japan, or I said the future is not like this upgrading of the old alliances. You got to keep those because they are the crucial now and for foreseeable future. But thinking that you're going to upgrade you got to maintain them and upgrade them, but that the region, that China is going to forever shelter under this U.S.-centered bilateral alliance system is not feasible. That's my view. But we may switch to a situation where that deteriorates rapidly because the President Trump has said, the Koreans are taking advantage of us, or the Japan pays all of it. It was cheaper to deploy those forces in those places than it would be to bring them back. Financially cheaper. So it's just, are you trying to, we'll see. As a political scientist, if we're kind of bloodless vultures sometimes, it's a natural experiment. If you want to unravel the existing U.S. leverage and influence in a region, it seems to be that kind of total erratic commentary is a quick way to do it. So maybe we'll see. I don't know. So that's the answer to that. The Southeast Asians, I don't think, are eating China's lunch. I think what you may be referring to, I'm not sure, is China is now an expensive place to invest in a way that it wasn't before. But that's a result of their success. So they themselves are investing. They're now investing in Vietnam and other places. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be left behind and the Southeast Asians are going above them. There's a lot of interdependence. There's a lot of trade. Within companies and within parts and components across the region. They're very interdependent. But yes, Southeast Asia has its own interests. And my point, I don't want to go on, but something you said earlier, they need, for them, security is both the reefs and the things that scare them or that are threatening, but also domestic stability and development. And so when they're looking at the U.S. and China, they are not naive. They know China may be throwing its weight around and be a threat, but they also need China as well for that type of security, domestic security, and so on. And my point is, if you have the wise diplomacy, which actually U.S. has shown in spots, and China really did a good job. I mean, they were just, whatever you think, for ill or better, they were very adroit from about that 1996 period for about 15 years after, and now this kind of nationalist weight-throwing idea has taken hold in Beijing. Whoever can offer those Southeast Asians a better deal, right? Now, they can't demand that because they're weaker, but I think it would be a clever and a visionary thing for the United States trying to bring along Japan and China, for example. Let's agree that we are having this power transition, and let's make it a rivalry for who can be the best neighbor, who can facilitate quality of life, including the environmental. I think Obama had that idea. If we can work together with China on the environment, that's something we share, and that can spread out. So let's swing that way hard, and not the FONOPS are going to have to happen, but if we could, they don't overreact. It's provocative what China has done there, but let's not use it to pop champagne corks and say now we've got our rationale for building up these kind of alliances and remilitarizing Japan or something of that sort.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is David. I spent quite a bit of time in the South China Seas, both in the Navy and the Merchant Marine. At one time, we were building an alliance called CETO, equivalent of NATO. What happened to that?
Not much. There's a long debate. In the end, even that organization was not really like NATO. It was in name. The U.S., for reasons that scholars have debated, it preferred what I called earlier the hub and spoke alliance structure, which is in part because those countries often were, like Japan and Korea have their own island dispute. It's called Takashima or Dokdo, depending. And the colonial history of Japan's occupation of Korea. So you, in some sense, you can't have that integrated military command structure like you do in NATO. So it was never really so the CETO they thought, but they didn't even design it really the same, and then it faded away. So what you have instead of a NATO where you have a pool, it's called collective security, you have the U.S. allied with Japan, the U.S. allied with Korea, the U.S. allied with the Philippines, the U.S. with, I guess Thailand has been declared a major non-NATO ally. But, so the U.S. Thailand, it's called the hub and spoke because the military relationships. Now, the U.S. is trying to encourage, and again, this is part of Japan's rearming move, to try to have interoperability and coordination among those militaries. Again, maybe to the extent that there has to do that to check China, fine, but what about having wider? They have also military exercises with China, Thailand, and others now. So as long as it's kind of including everyone and keeping everyone involved and enmeshed, remember enmeshment, I think that's fine. But trying to polarize or separate out, it ultimately is counterproductive, as well as not an avenue towards long-term stability there.
Roger Gerbert, and I have a question. I'd like to hear something about trends in China, because ultimately I think all this discussion is a waste of time, because the area is going to go where China decides it's going to go. And it seems to me that there are certain parallels here with the rise of the PLA within China and the situation in Japan in the 20s and the 30s. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. Well, there are two elements. One is what's going on within China, and then will that just log roll the region? There is this argument that it's going to be peaceful because everyone's just going to bandwagon. I signaled that with this phrase, which may be a little ambiguous. For most of recorded history, China was the dominant power, and they had this trade system which was disguised as tribute, but everybody had to acknowledge China as the center of civilization. They call it the Middle Kingdom because it's in the middle and everyone's peripheral. And China actually argues, or intellectuals in China argue that, you see, that was peaceful. In other words, you had to kind of literally kowtow, but we weren't going to invade you. Whereas the West's, its form of imperialism says all nations are equal, but then if you don't pay your debts, the gunboats come. So they were trying to say that whatever. So they're trying to say there's going to be a new version of this. And the power of China is going to be so great that other countries are going to bandwagon. They're going to sort of say, they're going to be forced to choose, and they're going to choose China, especially if the U.S. is as erratic as the criticisms even that I was sort of fears that I was voicing earlier. I don't think it can happen because these are modern nation states that are wealthy and developed and large. Japan is not going to accept a resurrection of that, a China-dominated Monroe Doctrine. The Taiwanese we were talking about earlier, they're integrated, but again, I think now having seen what's happened in China, what you're talking about, which is this recrudescence, this flourishing again of this sort of the security state in China and the repression and the not honoring of the one country, two systems, the gist of it. And so they're not going to accept it. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, and they're not. I don't think if the U.S. were to pull out too quickly, I think this cow's tongue thing would be. I think there would be a lot of instability. I don't think. So if I'm critical of U.S. Foreign policy in this region, it's because it's not thinking ahead in the way that I personally think should happen. But I don't think China can call the tune that way without. In fact, just as the U.S. I said over-promised and under-delivered, China is even worse. They had a good thing going, and then the PLA and the people got too strong. They've really blown it. They've really scared everyone, and they had a lot going, and no one is, and so they're doing this one belt, one road thing. They're trying to sweeten the deal with a lot of money. Boy, you can buy people's friendship a little bit, but they really lost a lot. They had gained so much, and they just squandered it all with this behavior. So I don't think people won't go down that route without a fight of some kind.
How many more questions are there? Okay, let me just ask, do we want the DVD? You mean what the DVD is?
DVD?
Okay, we'll show that then. And then let's thank Dr. Felker for his wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Right before you cue up the DVD, this is a little multimedia thing done in the New York Times. This is an old U.S. Naval vessel that has been run aground on one of these reefs, and there's an actual contingent this is a Philippine Marine detachment that has to sit there. And then China's out there patrolling on the outside of the reef, they have to resupply it by helicopter. But this shows you how, well, I would say, I'm contradicting what I just said about how Southeast Asians won't bandwagon. Philippines has almost started bandwagoning because they just don't have anything to resist with, and as you'll see from these images, they have to feed themselves by spearfishing, and it's not a very strong military posture, and they're watching the well-equipped Chinese on the outside and reporting in, and and this is, so it's I guess the bandwagoning scenario and China's inexorable rise is, it's not that it's not persuasive as a scenario, but I don't think Japan or Korea or Indonesia could resist. Actually, even though, the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry because I know we want to look at the video, is that the ruling in the courts, the International Tribunal, that was the Philippines. There was a Philippines government, and the U.S. is sort of reviving its alliance with the Philippines. It's deployed troops in Mindanao as part of the war on terror and so on. And the Philippines filed the lawsuit, and they won. They won totally, and the court said China's claims have no basis in international law and the law of the sea, et cetera, et cetera. But what had happened in the interim is a new president was elected in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who is sort of and he's like, look, I'm for the poor of the Philippines, and I don't care. And he insulted Obama, and he said the U.S. is dead to me, and went off to Beijing to get money. So, and he's shifted back and forth, but my point again is, if you overplay your hand, you wind up, with less. So I'll stop, and we'll look at the video.
Is building